I'm very happy to be here today and to be able to share with this group of like-minded and interesting people uh, the plants that I had sort of uh, been introduced to and found out about during my work in Mukteshwar. But before I start, I really want to thank India's Nature and all of the speakers who came before me as well in this series, as well as my advisors and academic mentors, Professor Shahabuddin and Professor Krishna, who have made this study possible. I'm just going to pause and share my screen.
Thank you.
Yes, welcome everyone again. Thank you for taking the time to be here today to listen to this sort of just sharing of different plants and my experience of them from Mukteshwar. As Ram mentioned, I started working in the Mukteshwar landscape about 1 year ago. And since then, I have encountered an astounding diversity of different plants there. And I have had the rare opportunities to study a not very well studied ecosystem from the ground up. And for this opportunity, I'm very grateful. My talk today is titled Perceiving Plants, and I chose this title because I feel it's something we often overlook and we often don't do. Plants are an immobile part of the landscape. They are not as sort of charismatic at times, or there's a perception that they are not as charismatic as animals or birds or insects. And because largely, I think, because they are immobile and they are inanimate, although they are definitely very alive. And I think to begin to observe plants, one just needs to slow down a little bit and reach their time scale. Hopefully, during the course of this talk, I will be able to introduce you or show you a little glimpse into this world of plants that I have been fortunate enough to be able to discover and explore. So what is it I mean when we talk about this world of plants? Plants are an incredibly diverse group of organisms everywhere in the world. So all of the species of vascular plants in the world, which includes sort of bryophytes or mosses and algae and ferns and shrubs and vines and trees, all of those together constitute about 391,000 species worldwide. This is one of the largest groups of living organisms there is. And for comparison, I have a few other species or groups and the number of species they contain listed here. So you can see that mammals are relatively small and they usually get all the attention in wildlife circles. There are only about 6,500 species of mammals out there. I know there are probably many avid birders in this group, but birds weigh in at only 11,000 species. And last week we had a wonderful talk by Samuel John on spiders. And while spiders come a little bit closer to the numbers that plants sort of embody, they are still nowhere comparable at only about 50,500 species. So this world of plants is like an incredibly vast area that is open for exploration. And a lot of it is not as well studied as these other smaller groups, of course, on account of its size, but also on account of just its sheer diversity. So there is a very rich environment for plant scientists out there, as rich an environment as there is for plants themselves. So within this extremely large group of 390,000 vascular plants, there are some sort of key families, which I've listed here. These are the three largest families of plants, of flowering plants. The asters are sort of sunflowers, the orchids are, well, orchids, and legumes are sort of peas, beans, anything that has a pod enclosing a bean is a legume. So you can see that even these individual families of plants far outnumber some of the larger groups like birds and reptiles and mammals. This is just to give an indication, of course, of the sheer diversity of plants that are out there. So within this global richness of plant species, India itself has about 45,000 species of vascular plants. And within that 45,000, the Himalayas are about 10,000 species. Despite the fact that this might seem like a relatively small number, it is an incredibly rich ecosystem. As you can see in these images, the Himalayas have very many very different kinds of ecosystems, from around forests to sort of these cliffside ecosystems to meadows to alpine meadows. And within this, my work and the work of the project that we're doing focuses more on the Mukteshwar area, which has a smaller subset of these Himalayan ecosystems. But even within this smaller subset, the ecosystems in and around Mukteshwar are extremely varied. So I have some of them represented here. So in the Mukteshwar area, which I'm sure many of our participants today are quite familiar with, we have ecosystems ranging from sort of open grasslands with very sparse vegetation and more of only grasses, sedges, and a few small shrubs. To then we also have open coniferous forests, which can also called pine forests. They are more of an open ecosystem characterized by a very sparse undergrowth and a more open, airy, light canopy. There are also mixed forests, which have both hardwood species like oaks and rhododendrons and myrica, etc., with conifers mixed in. So this is slightly more closed than a pine forest, or more dense than a pine forest, but still with a relatively open canopy. And there are also dense broadleaved forests. So they are dominated by species of oak and other hardwood trees, which form a very dense closed canopy. And they tend to have a very rich, diverse, and dense undergrowth filled with ferns and mosses and bryophytes and other shrubs. And then there are also riparian ecosystems, which means ecosystems that occur around streams or rivers, flowing water. And these ecosystems tend to be a little different in character as compared to these other forest types, because they are usually perennially moist. They have year-round moisture, although a lot of streams in the mountains are seasonal. But they do tend to have a higher level of moisture, and this supports a different kind of flora. In addition to these forest types, or rather ecosystem types that I've listed here, there are other sort of human-mediated ecosystems that also exist in the hills. For example, in the panoramic image at the bottom of my slide, you can notice sort of right of center, some fields and houses on that hillside. So there are a lot of agrarian or ecosystems influenced by agriculture in the hills. And these also host a great diversity of plant life, some of which I hope to introduce to you in this talk today. All of these ecosystems, how are they different from each other? Well, of course, we've gone over some structural and species composition differences right now in terms of the physical structure of the forests and the species that comprise them. However, there are differences in soil moisture, there are differences in the availability of nutrients, and there are also subtler differences such as in the availability of resources such as light, water, and also, sorry, when I meant subtler differences, I said in, for example, human mediation or human disturbance, there might be differences in the amount that an ecosystem is utilized for human use, which lays differing amounts of pressure on that ecosystem. So in all of these ecosystems, we have slightly varied conditions. And what I want to try and do during my talk today is to try and show you how plants adapt to these different environments, and how by looking at plants, we can make inferences about the environment from which they come or to which they are native. And by looking at the environment, inversely, we can also make inferences about the types of plants that grow there. So this is what I mean by a living landscape. It is a landscape that responds to the organisms that grow in it, as well as the organisms responding to the landscape that they live in. So during my talk, I want to try and familiarize you with this conversation, or the sort of the similarities, one can say the symmetry between the living organisms and the inanimate landscape. And above all, of course, I want to introduce plants as definitely part of the living organism group rather than the part of the inanimate landscape group, which I think they get put in rather unintentionally and unfairly sometimes. So beginning sort of talking about plant traits or plant adaptations, plants respond to the availability of various resources in their environment. The sort of major ones of these are light, also the availability, the quality and amount of light, water, again, the amount of water that exists in the ecosystem and whether it exists perennially or seasonally, the amounts and kinds of nutrients that are present in an ecosystem or a habitat, as well as the amount and frequency of disturbance that a particular habitat type undergoes. Plants are also impacted by and adapted to predators or organisms that might want to eat a plant, pollinators and dispersers, which are a whole host of organisms that help plants go through their life cycle, including pollination and ultimately spreading their seeds to new habitats where they can take seed and grow. So there's an entire range of other organisms such as predators, pollinators, and dispersers, which plants interact with, which also shapes their form and their adaptations to their environment. So the first part of my talk is going to sort of run you through a list of plant adaptations that are very commonly observed in the Mukteshwar area. And the second part of my presentation is sort of going to deal with some individual species that I find particularly charismatic or particularly interesting and their individual stories. So to get started, I have this tiny little crassula species, which you can see tucked into the crevice of a rock. So this environment is a very harsh environment. It's an environment which is exposed to a lot of sunlight because it's on a cliffside. It's also an environment that is extremely dry because it's on a vertical surface, so any water runs off of it. And you can see that this small succulent plant has evolved these fleshy leaves that help to store water so that there is an availability of water for the plant to carry out its life cycle. So these fleshy leaves, in fact, there are quite a few species that show this succulent leaf pattern in the Himalayas. So these succulent leaves are an adaptation seen in many plants to very high light and low water conditions. And this is not just in the Himalayas. I mean, it's many ecosystems around the world. Another adaptation to high light and dry ecosystems that is commonly seen in the Himalayas are these very fuzzy leaves. So this is an Anaphylis species, which is a small herbaceous plant found in Mukteshwar. It has this extremely dense mat of these silvery hairs covering its leaves. And these hairs serve two functions. One is that of almost sunscreen. So all of these hairs covering the surface of the leaves disperse the rays of the sun when they hit the leaves, and as a result, prevent these leaves from getting sunburnt or getting damaged by the very high light intensity that is often present in the mountains. And the other very interesting thing that they do is that they trap a layer of moisture very close to the leaves. So these hairs form like a net above the leaves which trap moisture, and this creates almost like a miniature greenhouse around each leaf. So it creates an environment of higher humidity around each individual leaf. And this environment of higher humidity prevents the plant from losing water through transpiration, because plants lose water more into a dry atmosphere, or rather a dry atmosphere tends to dry out more water from a plant's leaves. So by creating this personalized sort of greenhouse with these hairs on the leaf surface, a plant can actually regulate the amount of water that it loses by transpiration. So that's a pretty intelligent way to deal with a very dry, very sunny environment. There are other resource pressures that plants have to deal with. For example, again, very high or high sunlight or dry environments. And the Himalayas, of course, have many different kinds of conifer species or trees with needles. And needles themselves are an adaptation to very high light intensity as well as fairly seasonally dry conditions. So a lot of plants, a lot of coniferous plants occur in cold climates where there is a lack of water during the winter months, where water is usually trapped as ice and not available to plants. But in the Himalayas, particularly in the Mukteshwar area, we also have conifers, from very dry areas where there's not a lot of moisture availability in the first place. So conifers have this specialized layer of wax that is exuded by the cells on their surface of their leaves called a cuticle. And this waxy layer prevents the excess loss of water almost by acting like a sealant on the leaves, like a layer of varnish. So just like varnish on furniture protects it from moisture, this sort of layer of varnish on the leaves protects it from losing moisture. So it keeps in the moisture in the leaves so that they can grow in these dry environments. And this is very pronounced in some species. So for example, this is a species of cedar similar to Devdar that exists in Mukteshwar, but this is a different species called Cedrus atlantica from the US. And you can see the very clear sort of blue layer on the leaves, which is this thick waxy layer, which is the cuticle that prevents the loss of water. Some species have adapted to these dry conditions by evolving these scales on the underside of their leaves, and they serve a similar function to this waxy layer. They prevent the excess loss of water. They do this especially when these scales occur on the underside of the leaves, like in this shrub from the Mukteshwar area. It's an Elaeagnus species. It's also called an autumn olive sometimes in English. This species has these scales. You can see the silvery scales on the underside of the leaf, and these scales cover the pores of the leaves, and they sort of act again similar to the waxy layer and similar to the hairs that we saw in the previous slide on the Anaphylis. They prevent the excess loss of water. While actually looking up some species of Elaeagnus for this talk, I found this picture of an Elaeagnus scale. This is actually one scale from the bottom of the leaf, which is viewed under a microscope with some fluorescent dye. It's magnified 68 times. So you can see these scales are actually modified layers of the surface cells of the leaf. So they help to cover, they act as these plates to cover the underside of the leaf to prevent excess water loss. Many trees in Mukteshwar are also adapted to fire, since Mukteshwar is an extremely seasonally dry ecosystem. There is quite a lot of fire, and fire is also used by humans as a way of managing ecosystems for resources. So on fire-adapted species, you see this very thick layer of bark that is usually quite spongy. So bark of fire-adapted species tends to be quite soft. It can also be flaky at times, like this rhododendron bark seen on the left. But by and large, it has a bit of a spongy texture, and that is due to these large air pockets in the middle of the bark that give it this insulating property. So very much like a thermal insulation used in the walls of houses, or the thermal insulation used in airplanes. This is a layer that protects the internal sort of vasculature of a plant, or all of the sort of pipelines that go inside a plant to carry water and nutrients, all of the vessels. It protects those vessels from fire at ground level. So species such as Lyonia and the cheer pine or Pinus roxburghii have this thick corky layer of bark that protects them from occasional fires. So when we are observing a plant out in the field, if we see this thick corky bark that is quite spongy to the touch, we can sort of infer that the landscape that it comes from is perhaps a fire-prone landscape or a landscape that is more susceptible to regional fires. However, plants also have to adapt to the living elements of their ecosystem. And like we saw the hairs of the leaves modified into like a sunscreen for the plants, and we also saw the cells of the surface of the leaves modified into the scales in Elaeagnus. Surface cells in these nettle species. So on the left is the very commonly known Bichubuti or stinging nettle. And on the right is Girardinia, also called the Himalayan nettle, sorry. And both of these plants have evolved surface cells which are almost needle-like. So they have these glandular hairs. So these hairs are filled with chemicals that are very irritable to the skin of humans and also other animals. So this is largely to prevent herbivores from sort of chewing on or eating the leaves of these plants. Here is a close-up view of these hairs, and you can see how they almost resemble the tip of a syringe. So each of these hairs is made up of a single cell, and that cell is sort of modified into this tubular shape that contains these biochemicals regulated by a gland at the base. So whenever something touches this hair, it injects these chemicals into the skin of the animal trying to damage the plant, and it produces an irritable sensation. This is largely due to two chemicals, one being formic acid, which interestingly is the same chemical present in a lot of ant stings or ant bites. So interestingly, it's the same chemical in both of these organisms, which are quite far apart. We don't think that ants and plants would have a lot in common, but here is an example of something that they do. However, not all organisms in a plant's direct environment are those that they want to repel or those that they want to avoid. Some organisms, such as birds and insects, are actually very beneficial to plants because they help spread the seeds of those plants. In this case, they're called dispersers, or they help pollinate the flowers of those plants, and then they're called pollinators. So this is a photo of a euonymus species, of which there are several species in the Himalayas, although this is not a Himalayan species. This is a species from Europe. The Himalayan species of euonymus generally grow as large shrubs or small trees, and they're not very prominent in the landscape because they don't have very showy flowers, although they are extremely they have very interesting flowers. So if you come across one, definitely pause to look for flowers. But the interesting thing about euonymus is that it contains these, if you see, these are the fruits of the euonymus, and each seed is contained within the fruit, surrounded by this red fleshy layer. Now, this red layer in the fruit is called an aril. And an aril is a special part of a seed, which is evolved by certain plants in order to attract dispersers. So these euonymus species, all euonymus species typically have this very prominent, brightly colored, fleshy covering of their seed, which attracts many species of birds, which then eat the seed and then disperse it to another location. So this aril is a typical feature of these euonymus, and it's an adaptation that these plants have to attract dispersers. Similarly, this is a species of ginger from Mukteshwar. This is a wild species of ginger called Zingiber chrysanthemum. It contains when it fruits in the autumn, it has these fruits at ground level that sort of burst open in this bright red clusters. And each fruit contains these rows of black seeds. And as you can see, these black seeds here are also covered with that white fleshy layer. So in the euonymus, the fleshy layer ranges from either red to pink or orange. But in these ginger species, these seeds are covered by this layer, this white layer. And since these fruits open at ground level, this plant is trying to attract ants to disperse its seeds. So it's the same reward mechanism of this fleshy, nutritious layer that is produced around the seed, but it's targeted at a different organism. So in this case, when the seeds emerge in this plant, the fruits open very wide to reveal the seeds. And in this case, the fleshy aril attracts ants that carry off the seeds into their underground nests. And of course, once a seed is underground, it grows. So often you will see this ginger emerging from locations where there are ant nests because ants carry off their seeds into their nests. So these were some of the adaptations that I wanted to speak about and introduce you to. So hopefully this makes us a little more familiar with the broad characteristics that plants in the Mukteshwar area can have and the ways in which they're adapted to their environment. These adaptations range from ways to combat harsh sunlight and low levels of water in the landscape, but also range from evading predators to attracting beneficial organisms like birds and insects and ants. So now I want to go into discussing certain specific species, which I find particularly interesting or particularly like they have a very unique story, unique evolutionary story. Oh, sorry, I had one more slide of traits. Okay, so plants can also, in addition to birds, attract, of course, insects for pollination. However, some plants attract birds for pollination as well. A good example of this from the Mukteshwar landscape is this woodfordia. It's also called the firecracker plant sometimes in English because of its very bright flowers. And as you can see, these flowers have quite a unique structure where all of their anthers, these parts which contain the pollen, are all on one side of the flower rather than being in the center. So this arrangement is very typical of bird-pollinated plants. And in fact, you can see in this image that I found on the internet that is exactly what they do. They attract birds to pollinate, and you can see those anthers nicely brushing the forehead of this oriental white-eye and transferring the pollen, which the bird will then transfer to another flower on its next visit and effect pollination. So looking at the structure of flowers, such as whether their reproductive parts are off to one side or arranged symmetrically in the center, as well as the shape of the flower. So these flowers are tube-shaped and they're sort of ideal for a bird with a beak to get in and drink the nectar. So the shape and form of a flower can inform us of what may pollinate it. And similarly, as we saw in the previous slide, the shape and form of a seed or fruit can tell us what may disperse it. Similar plants or other adaptations for pollination are these color-changing flowers, which we can see in this horse chestnut species here. Mostly these flowers open in a red color. As you can see these red flowers here, this is a pollination guide. So it's just a blush of color on the top petals to sort of let a pollinator know that this is a place where it can find nectar. And on the second day, if the flower is pollinated already on the first day, then by the second day, the flower turns yellow, sort of letting the pollinator know that this flower has already been pollinated. So maybe you should go to another one where you might find better rewards. And of course, the plant will increase its pollination efficiency by directing pollinators to more flowers than have already been pollinated. So that's a very interesting technique that some plants adopt. And it's also seen in this Himalrandia species where flowers open this sort of white color on the first day, as you can see in the flower in the foreground. And by the second day, usually when they've already been pollinated, flowers turn this yellow color, sort of indicating to pollinators that this flower is already spent, it's already been pollinated, look for another flower. And we'll see in subsequent slides how not all plants adapt this strategy, but some of them have come up with this adaptation. So coming to some individual species, I wanted to start right at the very beginning of plant evolution. And this is one of my favorite plants from the area, which is often very overlooked because it just looks like a grass. But this is in fact a species called a horsetail or an equisetum. Equisetums are some of the oldest plants to ever grow on the earth. They actually grew about 170 million years before flowers evolved. So they are a very archaic, old form of plant, which rely on spores to sort of reproduce. Spores are not seeds, but they're similar to what ferns and mosses use for reproduction. And these plants in Mukteshwar can usually be found growing in damp areas around permanent stagnant water. So they are, you have to look a little hard for them, but they're quite easy to find once you know what you're looking for. And these date back to the Carboniferous period and even the Triassic period, which is almost 360 million years ago, which is when these plants evolved. And we have many fossils from that age that depict very similar plants. So it indicates just how little these plants have changed in structure over these millions of years. But even in this basic form of plant life, there are some very interesting adaptations. For example, the spores of these species, this is a scanning electron microscope image of a spore of an equisetum plant. It has these 4 spring-like appendages on each spore, and these springs are actually triggered by moisture. So when the springs come in contact with any water source, they release and the spore sort of flies to a distant area. So plants had not quite yet adapted the relationships with other organisms in their environment, but they had still come up with ways all the way back then, 360 million years ago, to get to different places. So I'm also finding myself contradicting one of the things I said right in the beginning of my talk, that plants are immobile. So actually we see that plants are not quite immobile. They have ways of walking or rather jumping around the place, and they can get quite far. These plants, equisetums in general, are very interesting. They also evolved this adaptation to have silica crystals in their stems, which makes their stems very tough and also very corrosive. So these crystals are meant to be make the leaves very hardened, so that large animals, and in that time these large animals were actually dinosaurs, so that dinosaurs can't eat these plants, or rather have a harder time eating them. Also, about 75% of Earth's coal deposits were formed during the Carboniferous period, and these plants dominated at that time. So actually, a lot of the fossil fuels that we burn today in our industries and in our vehicles come from fossilized horsetails. So I find it really fascinating that this sort of relic of plant evolution can be found right in Mukteshwar, right on our doorstep. The next plant I want to talk about is this honeysuckle that is actually not native to Mukteshwar. It's introduced from Japan, but Mukteshwar has its own set of native honeysuckle species. This species is Lonicena japonica, and it looks fairly unassuming until you take a look at its new leaves. So these are the young leaves of the same species, and this is a really interesting adaptation that this plant has come up with. So this plant, when it produces new leaves, it produces these very lobed leaves with many different segments, which look quite different visually from the mature leaves, which have a very smooth margin. And this is largely to confuse possible herbivores again. So imagine that you were a herbivore looking for a snack, either a deer or a monkey, and you saw a leaf that you didn't recognize as edible, um, it's very unlikely that you would eat that leaf for risk of being poisoned. So these plants actually, when their leaves are new and tender and most attractive to herbivores, it puts on this disguise. It adopts this leaf shape that a herbivore wouldn't recognize, so as to sort of hide in plain sight from its predators. So this is a very interesting adaptation to avoid herbivores. Not all plants like nettles have the resources to spend on making chemical injections to ward off their predators. So this plant has adopted just a very simple strategy to change its leaf shape when it's young. This plant actually shows another adaptation that we've already talked about as well. You can see the flowers in this image on the left, and they too start off white, and on the second day they become yellow. So they do also signal to pollinators that which flowers are the freshest and which flowers are unpollinated. So you can see plants using different adaptations to interact with and sort of manipulate different living elements also in their landscape. So we start to see this picture of plants as highly intelligent and highly evolved organisms. This plant, for example, also produces this plant is utis, commonly known as utis in the hills. It's Alnus nepalensis, or the Nepalese alder. These plants form these clonal colonies, as you can see in this picture on the right. So that means that the same tree will put out shoots from underground that give rise to new trees around it. So they tend to form these large monodominant stands, as you can see in this image, and with many of the same species in the same region. And together, these species have come up with a very interesting security measure against against predators. So when one plant is being attacked by an insect or a predator, it releases these biochemicals called volatile organic compounds into the environment. And these chemicals inform the plants around it actually that it is under attack. So when the neighboring plants sense these threat chemicals, they can actually increase the production of toxins in their leaves to protect themselves preemptively from an attack. So before they have even been attacked, they are informed of this attack by their sort of co-inhabiting members, their brothers and sisters. So these sort of trees have adapted this unique way of defending themselves against predators. But again, then we also talk about attracting pollinators. And of course, the best way to do that is flowers. Orchids are known for having extremely unique flowers, and this one is a foxtail orchid that is found commonly in the area. There are two adaptations in this plant that I really want to highlight. One, of course, has to do with the flowers. These flowers have a very different strategy from others in terms of maximizing the efficiency of pollination. So these flowers, if they are unpollinated, they can last on the plant for 30 to 40 days. So they're very long-lived flowers. Usually flowers only last a few days because they're quite expensive in terms of resources for plants to make. So these flowers last 30 to 40 days in terms of their longevity if they are not pollinated. However, the minute a flower is pollinated, it dies. So each flower, when it is pollinated, the plant sort of kills off that flower by triggering a biochemical reaction. So pollination itself, the mechanical process of pollination, triggers a biochemical reaction in this plant that tells it that, okay, this flower's function is served, let's stop maintaining it. So it's a very interesting adaptation, again, to sort of maximize the efficiency of pollination and make sure that the plant doesn't have to keep alive more flowers than is necessary at any given point of time. The other really interesting adaptation is that this orchid is an epiphyte, which means it grows on the bark of trees. And it has evolved these special roots that can be seen in this video here, which are called velamin roots. In fact, Dr. G.S. Rawat on his talk on orchids mentioned this as well. And these roots have a very interesting process of absorbing water from the environment. So they have this layer of dead cells on the surface that makes them look this silvery color. And I'm going to play this video now. So you can see how immediately on coming contact with water, these cells absorb water very quickly and turn green. So you can see that change happening in this video here. So you can see instantly that this root becomes a very bright green color. And that's because these cells have absorbed water instantly and become transparent. So this is a very useful adaptation for a plant that grows high up in the canopy, where it only has to rely on rainwater. So the minute it rains, these plant cells quickly absorb this water so that they can survive the coming dry period. Okay, I will move to plant evolution actually gets quite complicated, and that's made very clear in this species here. This is a snake lily. It blooms in the summer in Mukteshwar in dense forests, and it has a very, very interesting pollination strategy. So it actually is pollinated by these small fly-like organisms called fungus gnats. And it attracts these fungus gnats by producing chemicals that smell like fungus. So of course, this plant is not a fungi, it is a flowering plant, but it produces these chemicals that mimic a fungus to attract these fungus gnats. And the fungus gnats enter this sort of tube here and reach all the way down. Now, here is when the plant, when it gets really interesting. So in this plant, there are separate male and female flowers. So the male flowers, as you can see in this image on the top, the male flowers have this small pore at the base, which is around here, through which these fungus gnats can escape. So once the fungus gnat enters the tube of the flower, it knocks around until it gets coated in pollen, and then eventually it finds this small hole here and escapes. But in female flowers, this hole doesn't exist. So actually the gnat gets trapped at the bottom and it dies within this plant. So this is a very unusual pollination strategy, because given that pollinators are benefiting a plant, it makes no sense for a plant to kill its pollinators. But in this case, these snake lilies or arisemas are a very broad genus of plants with many, many, many species. And they have done this to make sure that those species remain distinct. So this method of, this is actually called pollination by lethal attraction, which I find quite a catchy name. But you can see it sort of represented here, where this is a male plant on the left and a female plant on the right. And it allows the fly to get pollen from the male plant and escape and deposit the pollen on the female plant, but the pollinator dies in the female. So this is actually evolved this mechanism to prevent outcrossing of plants. So for those with a slightly better understanding of evolution, this provides a reproductive isolation for each of these species, which basically helps the species grow into more and more species, rather than converging towards one common sort of species by interbreeding. So it helps keep all of these various different species of snake lilies distinct and avoiding cross-pollination. The final example that I want to share with you today is this mistletoe. This is a species of mistletoe on the left from Mukteshwar, which is called Taxilus. It grows on trees, again, as a parasite. And it has a very unique way of dispersing its seeds. And before I share that with you, I want to play this video for you. So this video doesn't have sound. So you can see this is an Australian example, actually, but the Indian species function in the same way. You can see here an Australian mistletoe bird, which is eating the berries of the mistletoe. It's extracting the flesh and eating the berries. And all species of mistletoe are surrounded by this sticky goop. So this goop, when the bird sort of excretes it, it needs to be rubbed off like this on the branch of the tree. I'll just replay that section at the end. So you can see how the bird has evolved this behavior to eat the mistletoe berries and rub off the seed on the branch. And this actually is perfect for the mistletoe because it needs to be anchored high up in a canopy to be able to parasitize its host. So since it doesn't root into the ground, since it roots into another species, it needs to sow its seeds high up in the canopy. And it's evolved this rather ingenious mechanism of doing that by evolving these very sticky seeded fruits that need to be wiped off like this by a bird on the branches. So it's evolved this mechanism of planting itself very high up in the canopy, which I found is just absolutely fascinating. So Mukteshwar is an incredibly diverse ecosystem, and as well as the Western Himalayas, of which it's part. And this diversity encompasses so many interactions with other species of organisms, including birds and insects, and as well as humans. And a lot of these plants have medicinal, cultural, religious value in the communities which also inhabit these areas. A lot of these plants are valued as ornamentals in gardens. In fact, many species native to the Himalayas have been taken to the West, to Europe and the US and the UK to be planted in gardens there because they are so beautiful and because they have so much ornamental value. So despite the fact that these plants have so many different functions and there's such an astounding diversity, Himalayan ecosystems are quite threatened. So in this last few slides, I'm going to quickly go over the threats. I know I'm running short on time. So we started off with a map or sort of this figurative representation of plant species in India. And this 18,000 represents all of the flowering plants in India. And of that, the Himalayas actually contain more than 50% of all of the flowering plant species in India. And of that 50%, over 436 species are considered to be threatened with extinction. That means they are on the IUCN list and listed as threatened, although there will be many other species apart from this which haven't made it to the IUCN list or haven't been assessed yet. Also, 40% of all Himalayan flowering plants are endemic to the Himalayas. That means they are found nowhere else in the world. So the fact that their range geographically is so limited means that they are even more the subject, or should be even more the subject of conservation efforts and conservation research in India. The Himalayas also are a geologically and climatically very vulnerable ecosystem. They are very prone to climate change. In fact, a report by the IUCN Red List of Ecosystems found that mountain regions are extremely prone to climatic changes and also the global warming and the changing of sort of seasonal patterns of rainfall and drought, etc. So this poses unique geographical threats to these plant species. And of course, there's a rapid rate of habitat loss, urbanization, land use change. Despite the fact that agriculture is not a significant threat in the mountains currently, the development of mountains for urbanization, construction, and sort of development, what we see as infrastructural development, is extremely prevalent and poses a threat to the ecosystems of some of these species. Also, the fact that so many of these species are prized by people or useful for people means that often these species are subject to overexploitation for the medicinal plant industries, as well as for the cosmetic industry and the ornamental horticulture industry. So the overexploitation and commercialization of plants is also a significant threat. This map represents IUCN Red List species across the Western Himalayas. And as you can see, there's quite a significant concentration of them in Uttarakhand. So I know that there are many people joining us from Uttarakhand today, and this is just to drive home the point that Uttarakhand as a state has many, many species that are threatened today. Two species that we have found just during the course of our study is this Roscoia, which is from the ginger family, and Crepedium, which is an orchid. And both of these, although not globally endangered, are listed locally as endangered species. Roscoia is vulnerable to extinction and Crepedium is actually endangered. And interestingly, both of these species are endangered due to overcollection for the wild. because they are involved. They are ingredients of Chyawanprash, actually, both of them, which is for those who don't know, it's an Ayurvedic sort of supplementary thing. But I have nothing against Chyawanprash. It's just that it's just an example to drive home how some of the biopharmacology can be quite harmful for certain species if it's not done within sustainable levels and with sufficient checks and balances. So lastly, I just want to quickly go over how does one get into plants and how does one get into watching plants. So the great thing about plants is that you don't need any checklist, you don't need binoculars, you don't need a camera, you can just go out and watch plants. There are some things to observe that I've listed out, which you can read over, and I'm not going to go over them in detail because I'm out of time. But specifically, I think it's important, I would like to make a note of this, that it's important to observe mindfully. Plants can't move, so like animals and birds and insects, they can't run away. So often in our pursuit for plants, we may actually end up damaging the ecosystems in which they grow. So one just has to be mindful of when one is observing a particularly delicate or any ecosystem, really, to make sure that you're not trampling or you're not altering that ecosystem in any way. It's very useful to keep records. If you have the ability to take photographs and can store them, then photographs are extremely useful. But observations of all of the characteristics of a plant is very useful. And I think it's excellent to share your knowledge with other people, because I feel plants are such a vast subject, like we've already discussed, that one person is never enough. So I always find it very, very comforting and also very useful to function in a community. And on the subject of community, of course, I have to bring up iNaturalist. It's such an excellent platform. I think a lot of people on this call probably use it a lot more frequently than I do, but it's a wonderful platform to share knowledge. And there are some other online resources that I've listed that I use to help me identify plants. But for the Mukteshwar region in specific, since I know that there are many people joining us from there, these are 3 books that I find very helpful. One is Flowers of the Himalaya by Colonial and Stainton. The other is Plants of Kedarnath by Dr. G.S. Rawat and others. And the third is Flora of the Valley of Flowers by Dr. Keshava Murthy. On that note, I thank you for your attention and for bearing with me. And I would be happy to take any questions if there are any, but otherwise, thank you very much.